With floor covering textures now applied, in this class we'll go through some of the adjustments and layer styles that we can apply to previously laid down textures, as well as look at blocks and how to import other objects. And we'll also take a look at layer organization. So as we picked up on the last class, in this file I've completed my floor coverings, and you'll notice that they're all of relatively mild colors or tones, except for the pink terrazzo tile that I've applied in the bathrooms, which will probably be left in that sort of similar tone. But it does start to set the tone in terms of the color palettes we're going to use. So what I'm going to do is in the layers palette, what I've done is I have filed all of the flooring underneath one group, and the way that you do that is relatively simple, and we'll go through that shortly. So first things first, what we're going to do is we're going to now use the paint bucket tool to paint in areas that don't necessarily need a texture, that won't need a texture. So some of those key areas will be areas like the wardrobes. You won't really need a texture in there, but you also don't want to leave it as just a blank white or the paper color. Also inside of cupboards and pantries and wardrobes, and also some of the service riser areas. The other item as well will be plumbing fixtures. At the moment, the plumbing fixtures or anything that would be like a plasticky white material is obviously white because the paper by default is white. However, if I turn that background off, which is the base layer here, you'll see we get this checkerboard finish. That means that there is no color underneath of that. So we can see that there is no white texture or white color applied, paint bucketed to these plumbing fixtures. And we want to do that because further down the track we want to modify those to give us shadows and highlights and reflect as if, you know, like a plastic or an acrylic material actually would. So let's start with more paint bucket work. So I'm going to I'll turn back on my background. The CAD layer is the colors layer is currently turned off, which is good. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new layer. Double click on that layer, and let's call this one cupboards and risers. And I've already completed this in a future tutorial. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to sample the color that I used. So I'm going to get my eyedropper, grab that color. And you can see it's just a mild brown sort of grey tone. So I'm on my cupboards and risers layer. I am on my paint bucket tool, and I am just going to go around now and paint these out. So again, these are for service risers and cupboards. They're not for wardrobes per se. Wardrobes will be done in a slightly lighter color. I think that's all of it. Oh, and the fireplace as well. There we go, that's done. Okay, so that's my cupboard and risers layer. And again, if I flick that off, we can see that. Excellent. We'll make another one, and I'll double click on that layer, and we'll call this one wardrobes. I'm just going to back to my future drawing and just select that again. So this is like a very light cream color. So now I'm going to go around inside of the wardrobes and paint those, and you can see those are just changing. So at the end of the day, what we're trying to get to here is we don't want anything in the drawing that is still white, and by white I mean like paper white. So even components of the plan that will be white, we want to paint them white. Okay, so I think that's the majority. That's all the wardrobes done. Yep. Actually, in fact, I need to do inside of the medicine cabinets as well. So I'm going to go back to my cupboards and risers layer. Click that. I'm going to sample by holding down Alt. So I'm in my paint bucket tool. Hold down Alt on the keyboard, and you can see I get the little eyedropper tool. Click one of those areas which I was painting with the cupboards and risers layer, and then just start clicking away. And now you can see I'm applying that color, and I'm doing that just to the medicine cabinets in the bathroom. Okay, done. That's great. All right, so I will now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another layer, double click, oops, double click on the word layer 2. I'm going to call this one white plumbing fixtures. All right, white plumbing fixtures. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn off my base layer. So that's the rectangle layer down here. I'll turn that off. And now it's very obvious where I haven't painted those white material. So I'm going to click on my white plumbing fixtures layer, make sure that is activated. And now go around with just a white color. So change that from my swatch tool here. Just click this, drag it up to here for full white. And now let's go around and paint that. So I'm not convinced that's fully white, is it? Yes, it is. Okay. So I'm just going around painting all of my plumbing fixtures. Anything that would be like a plasticky white acrylic. Now, the other thing that might happen is as you're painting around, you may not get, it may not select the entire area that you want when you click. Just double check that up here in the options bar that your tolerance is relatively high. In this instance, I can make it as high as 100. All that means is it's the tolerance for the color of pixels surrounding the pixels that you're selecting. So if it's a high tolerance, it means any pixel that's next to yours that is relatively close, it's going to pick it up and colorize it. The lower the number, the more tolerant or the less tolerance there is. So the color value between two pixels next to each other would have to be extreme. By the way, in terms of pixels, if we zoom right in, so we're zooming right into this like tile floor pattern, you can see each individual pixel here, and that's what it's referring to. The higher the tolerance, the higher likelihood that if I was to color this pixel next to it would also be colored. The lower the tolerance, the further apart these two colors would have to be before it starts picking that up. All right, so I'm going to keep going around. Important to note that I am doing everything that is like a white acrylic, but you'll notice I'm not doing the shower heads and I'm not doing some of these sinks because these would be a stainless steel. And so we'll do that with a different color because we want to treat that slightly differently. All right. Yep, that's done. That's all good. So we've got that now. And I'll just turn off my CAD lines. I like turning off the CAD lines every now and again just to sort of see how it's all looking. Yep, nice. I'll turn back on my background. All right, so we now have 3 layers that we've been using the paint bucket on. But the paint bucket more is in like our actual intended finish result rather than the colors paint bucket layer, which was, you know, just coloring everything aggressively so we could get a selection tool out of it. So with these 3 layers now, I'm going to click on the first one, which is wardrobes, and then hold down shift and click on the bottom one, which is cupboards and risers. So it selects all 3 of these layers. In the bottom of the layers palette, I'm going to click on this little folder here, and it groups those layers into that folder. And I can double click on the folder name, and in this instance I'm going to call this one paint. Actually, I'll do it in capitals. Paint bucket. Done. And I can also color code this. You can see with the flooring here it's got like a purple color. This just helps break up the file. It becomes much easier to navigate your different layers. So in order to do that, just right click on it, and then the colors are down here. So I tend to start at the bottom. So violet was the first one, blue is the second, and I'll just work my way up and then repeat the pattern again and again. And that way, if I want to know what is in my paint bucket layer, I can click on this little arrow here, and it drops that down, and you can see all the blue is applied to within this group. So it becomes pretty easy to see what is associated to what. It's a good way to keep track of your layers, especially in a file like this where we'll end up with, 60 to 100 different layers. Okay, that's now done. So we've got our paint bucket tool there. That looks good. All right, next up is let's go through the flooring materials and going through just a few adjustments. Now, this will not be all of the adjustments. There are many, many more that we can use, but we'll use them. We'll start adding to these as we see fit. There's no need to go through the full suite of them now because it just wouldn't be applicable, and there's a high chance that we'll just end up forgetting what this workflow was further down the track when we need to implement it. So we'll go through a few of these today and then continue to apply more of these sort of adjustments and layer styles as we see fit. So what I'll do is I'm going to select firstly, let's go with this carpet, the floor rug here. So there's two ways I can select layers. I can either go, I know that's a floor rug, so I know it's under my floor coverings group. I could click the arrow, go to my floor rugs and select it, and now I have that layer selected. The other way that you can select layers, which is a much quicker way of doing it, is to simply right click anywhere on the screen. And so when you right click on the screen, it will come up with basically it will come up with like a list of items that are underneath your cursor that you could select. So here you can see that there is the floor coverings group, which I could select. So that'd be all of the layers within that group. I could then select maybe just the floor timber, the timber flooring, or I could even select just the rectangle, which is underneath the entire drawing, the white rectangle. So in this instance, I'd say I want to click on my timber flooring, and now you can see in the layers palette, it navigates to that, and that layer is now highlighted. So I'll do that with the floor rug. I'll right click on it, and then I'll click on floor rug, and now I'm on the floor rug layer. Okay, so what I've done as well is I've just taken a snapshot of a reference drawing. This is just like some reference colors that I like the look of. And I want to use these as a bit of a guide. So I want to make these rugs this sort of grey off gunship grey sort of blue. So in order to do that, with my floor rugs selected, I'm going to go down to the bottom of my layers palette, and there's this little half moon icon, and these are called layer adjustments, and this is the non-destructive way to edit. So it essentially will add another layer, which is called an adjustment layer, and then we can either apply it to the full stack or to just one layer. And so what I mean by that is when I click on this little half moon icon, we get all the different adjustment tools. We're going to use Hue Saturation. That's all in this instance. And Hue Saturation is about halfway down. All right, so I'll click on that. And so what happens now is once I do that, two things may happen. You may get a screen that looks like this. So there's a palette which shows those adjustments, or you might not. If you don't see this at the top of your palette, at the top of your palette screen, you can just double click on this icon here, and it should bring up this window. The reason why it doesn't for me is because I've docked it in the palette, in the palettes area. So what I'm going to do is in these controls here, let's just say for instance, what happens here is you've got the hue, which is really like the sort of the huey tone that's set on this color. Now, this is why specifically I suggest that you pick relatively neutral or monochromatic colors, because it gives you the widest spectrum to introduce new colors to your textures. If this was already like a bright green rug, it is very unlikely I could make that like a beigey rug, let's say. But if it starts off as a gray tone, I can make it basically any color that I want. So when moving the hue around, okay, you can see what's happening. Firstly, notice, take a look at the floorboards and take a look at my tiles. You can see as I'm moving this around, that's changing color. Now, this is not exactly right because it's doing it to every layer when I just want this to be actioned on the rug and that's it. So the reason for that is because you can see this acts as a layer, and essentially because the layers are showing you essentially anything below is below the layer above. So anything at the top of the stack is at the top of the layers. It sits above everything else. So because the hue saturation is sitting here, it's affecting everything underneath of it, which is basically all the flooring. If I want to affect only one layer down, the command for that, it's a little bit tricky to pick up on at first, but what you have to do is hold your mouse in between the line between the two layers. There's like this line here. If you hold your mouse there, and then hold Alt on your keyboard, you get this little arrow with a little square. What that means is it's going to apply this adjustment just to the layer below. So I'm holding down Alt on the keyboard, and then I'm going to click. And then you end up with like this little arrow shape here. That means that this layer adjustment is applied just to the floor rug. Now you'll see as I start editing this, this rug, it only affects the rug. I'm not colorizing anything else. So the other thing to note is because it is a gray tone, when I use this hue saturation and move it around, nothing is really changing because the hue is already a gray tone. So I can't really add too much pink or green or anything like that to what is already a gray tone. So what I will do is I'll set both of these back to 0. I can double click in here and just type 0. 0. All right. But what I am going to do is click this little button down here called colorize. Okay, and what that will do was it will actually sort of transform the color of the rug to whichever color I choose. So now I have the full spectrum of colors here, and I have the saturation. So I'll bring the saturation up, I don't know, somewhere, we'll start with 50%, somewhere around there. And you can see now as I drag through this color swatch, this color slide, it's changing the color of that rug. This is the power of hue saturation and using the colorize tool, and why I say to you that you don't need every material under the sun. You just need a good material at a high resolution that is seamless, and then just adjust the colors as you see fit. So here, if I want that sort of dark blue, I'll go to a blue color. I'll then drag the saturation out of it so it's not as vibrant, and then I'll drag the lightness down as well. So we're getting close. That's still probably too blue. Yep, something like that. That's relatively close. This is why it's always helpful to have an example nearby. Cool, let's go with something like that for now. All right, so that's done. So I've applied a hue saturation to the floor rug layer. Once I'm done, I don't need to do anything. It updates straight away. I can just click on the next layer. And the next layer, let's work on the carpet. So let's do the same thing for the carpet. I'm going to right click on the carpet layer and then select where it says carpet. And now I jump to the carpet layer, and let's do that again, but let's use some other tools. So let's go, we'll click on the half moon, and actually, no, we'll do that one more time. We'll use hue saturation, click on colorize, and you can see now it's picked up every layer beneath the stack. So again, make sure that I apply this just to the layer below, which is the carpet, by holding Alt on the keyboard and moving my mouse to in between the two layers, and then click. So now you can see it's just making the carpet red. So let's go through this, and we'll give it a bit of like a sandy color. I'm going to try and get to a color that looks like this here, this sample. So I'll bring the lightness right up. It's a bit of a creamy sort of color. Yeah, it's pretty close. Yep, excellent. Okay. Yeah, not too bad. And this is why the non-destructive editing component is so good, because if I'm not happy with these colors, I can always come back to these adjustments as if it's a layer. So let's say for now, okay, I'm happy with that flooring. And this is what will happen is as you adjust other layers, you'll want to go back and adjust previously adjusted layers. And again, this is why non-destructive editing is so critical. So I'm relatively happy with that carpet. We've come a long way. You think about that's what the carpet looked like before. I'm just clicking on the hue saturation layer and just clicking the eyeball so it turns off. And I'll turn that back on. You can see what a difference that makes. And you can see now how the rug, in particular in the bedroom, sort of sits much better between those two colors rather than before with that darker browny gray color. All right, so let's go to the floorboards. Right click on the floorboards, timber flooring. And we're going to do the same thing again, but let's use some other tools this time. So I'm going to click on the little half moon icon, the layer adjustments. Click on that, and let's use levels. Okay, so I'll click on that. And again, before I do anything, Alt on the keyboard, click, just apply it to the timber floorboards layer. And so what you're seeing here up here is looks like an equalizer, and essentially showing you the values at the color ranges. So this is like very dark, very bright in terms of RGB. So 000, 250, 250, 250. And then I can use these arrows to move them around to change the tone. So keep an eye on the floorboards. If I bring this up, what this does is it makes the darks darker, like dark. Every value that's dark, I'm bringing it up and crushing the image. I can go the other way. I can make the lights lighter by going with this little arrow here and dragging it to the left. You can see we can overexpose it to the point we can't even see it anymore. What I am going to do is I'm going to take the middle value and drag this further down, make this a little bit lighter, like so. Okay. Now this is just for my textures. For yourself, this will be completely different. It will be completely variable depending on the materials you choose to use. Okay, so we have the levels adjusted, and now I want to take out some of the contrast. I don't want to see the pattern as strongly. I want it to be a little bit softer on the eyes. So actually I might just bring the back a little bit. What I'll do is I'll click on the half moon, do another one. Let's just use brightness and contrast, and again hold Alt on my keyboard, press the arrow, and now we've got a brightness and contrast adjustment layer and then a levels layer, both being applied to the timber flooring. And you'll see that if I bring the brightness down, you can see it's only affecting the timber flooring. So I'll bring that back up. But what I will do is I'm going to take the contrast. So that's high contrast, 100. I'm going to bring it right down. So it looks a little bit more dull, but it's a little bit more even across the floor on the eyes. Okay. Okay, looks good. All right. That will do the trick for now. We will update these as we go though. I have no doubt we'll end up updating these as we go. Let's do one more thing to the carpet flooring. Now again, a lot of these adjustments are made throughout your project, but a lot of the times what happens is once everything is placed into position, like all your textures are there, then you go through and start sort of choreographing this together. It's sort of like getting all your paints on the canvas and then coming through and blending them correctly and then working on your form and getting the sharp edges and the correct shadows and whatnot. It's much the same here. But what I will do is let's go back to the carpet. And this time, instead of using the half moon icon, which is the layer adjustment, we're going to use something called layer styles. And the way you activate that is just to double click on the layer anywhere, and you get this window appearing called layer styles. Now there is a ton of different layer styles. We can add a bevel, we can contour it, we can stroke it, like put a line around the outside of the layer, inner glows, stains, color overlays, there's tons of stuff. The one that we are going to look at right now is we're going to use what's called an inner shadow. So if I tick that, you can see that straight away I get this thing that essentially exactly that. It takes that texture and it puts a shadow around the bounds of that area of that texture. And in order to adjust that inner shadow, I click on where it says inner shadow, and we can see here the blend. We can go through these options. Blend mode, multiply. Again, you basically always want that. The opacity is essentially just how dark or how strong that is. So that's pretty self-explanatory. The angle, we're going to choose, I think, 45 degrees, and I'd like you guys to do the same one because essentially we'll have it so light is coming from the 45-degree angle down, and this will be critical when we start putting in more lights later. So we can have a shadow around the bed here. This will make a lot of sense once we start putting in lights. The distance, just play around with these a little bit. You can see the distance is the distance away from that source. So a distance of 0 essentially means that the light is straight, as in like it's coming straight down the page onto the floor. The further the distance away is, you can see that it's starting to shift the shadow across. So I tend to, it's really much of a muchness. You can either have the shadow at 0, so it just sort of blends it around. Of course, the opacity though, I'd have much, much lighter. I would have it probably only like maybe 15%. When you look around, you should be able to barely notice it. It's just there, so it breaks up the texture and doesn't make it as matte, like a matte finish. The choke will be sort of how strong the edges are. You can see the higher the choke is, that sort of more defined the edges are. So to be honest, a relatively low choke is important, so you don't see those edges as obviously. And then the size is just simply the distance that it's moving in terms of the depth of the shadow. There's no right or wrong here. It really is just playing around. But what I like to do normally is turn the opacity right up so it looks, it doesn't look right. But what it does do is allows me to see very obviously these other adjustments. So size and choke. distance I'll put across like so, and then bring the opacity right down to say only 15%. Okay, so we've applied this just to the carpet layer, and a good way to see what effect that's having. So I just clicked OK to get out of that command. But when I zoom back like this, in the layer now, you'll see there's an effects palette underneath of the carpet layer, and then there's these eyeballs. And so this eyeball will turn off all effects that are on the layer, and then the inner shadow here, if you click that eyeball, it will just click that effect off, because you can have multiple effects on one layer. So if I turn that off, just keep an eye on the carpet over here, and you'll see the difference. That's just one example. Now you'll do this basically for almost every layer, and in the bathroom we'll do probably another one. We'll use like an inner glow where you get hot spots or reflecting spots from where lights would be shining down onto a reflective surface. But again, let's go through those a little bit later. First and foremost, very similar to how when you did the colors layer, the intention was just color everything, get a color on everything so there is no white. So we have the option to pick and select every item in here. The same thing applies with textures. I just want you to texturize basically everything except for those items that are going to need a paint bucket. So items that don't necessarily have a texture are things like, again, the risers and the cupboards. The wardrobes don't. Again, I'm using like an off creamy white. The plumbing fixtures do not have a texture, but you still need to paint them white. And the other one would be anything that's stainless steel. So the cooktop, the sinks, the shower heads, I would still paint these under the paint bucket layer, but paint them on just like a light silvery gray. In fact, I might just do a few of those while I'm demonstrating. So now I'm finished with the floor coverings for now. I'll click on the little arrow here, and that closes that folder back up. I'm going to open up the paint buckets layer. Just click on wardrobe, and then I'm going to click and make a new layer. So now I've got another layer. I'll right click and call this one stainless steel. I'll grab my paint bucket tool, and I'm just going to use a very bright gray. So maybe like 250, 250, 250. Or maybe 245, 245, 245. So I'm adjusting the RGB in a very precise manner, or I can just like move my mouse around the swatch. Okay, so again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off the rectangle layer as well, so it's very clear where I have and haven't painted. And now I'm just clicking away. Again, Control Z if I accidentally click on something that I didn't want to. Whoop. Okay. I haven't done the top of the stove yet. I'll do the burners in a darker color, but I'll keep going. I've got another one in the butler's pantry. And then in the laundry, and I think, oh no, then the shower heads too. So make sure I grab that. And that's why it's really important to have the background layer turned off. So when I see that checkerboard, I know for sure there's no texture applied. 2 shower heads are done. If I get really detailed, I need to do the floor waste as well. So I'm just going around painting. Oops, too far. What's happening there is when I accidentally click on a black line, that goes to show that tolerance. Essentially, it finds anything that's equal to that black pixel, which makes sense, is going to colorize it. So that's why I keep accidentally selecting it. Go back to my shower. And then this floor waste. All right. All right, looks good. I'll turn back on my background. And again, I'm just going to turn off my CAD layers. Yeah, it looks pretty good. Yep. Turning the CAD layers off as well, because we're going to do a lot of work with the CAD lines, the CAD layer. It won't just look like this at the end. We'll end up, using a brush over it and smoothing it out and making some bits darker, some bits lighter, etc. But it's nice to turn it off every now and again just to get the real balance. We can really see now the colors, the complementary between these sort of grey, beigey tones, the dark, that sort of gunship grey blue of the rugs mixes really well with the pink terrazzo tile. All right, so next up, let's go through, let's finish this off with some furniture. So I'm going to go to my sofa. Again, I've colorized everything here. Absolutely everything has a color, but this will be a bit of a mixture of a texture and paint bucket. So I'm going to, all right, I'm going to do this. I'm going to go up to, so I've already opened up a fabric. So I'm just going to use just a gray, silvery sort of just fabric texture, which I found online. I'll go back to here, make sure I'm on my colors layer, go select, color range, and then click the sofa. And if I'm accidentally, you can see as I pull this fullness up, if I pull it up to like 200 or even like 170, you can see how a lot of stuff is selected, because these pixels, the higher I guess the lower the tolerance, the more it's going to pick up other pixels that are of similar value. So I'm going to bring that right down to around about 40. So now it's basically, if it's not this type of pixel, it's not picking up anything. And then that way, when I click OK, I'll get a very nice clean selection of those couches. So I've done that now. I've got my sofas selected. Back up to my fabric, Control A, Control C to cut it. Remember that my layer should be unpadlocked. It might be padlocked by default. So Control A, Control C, back to my drawing, edit, paste into, paste special, and then paste into. And then there is my texture. Now, if I hit Control T and I zoom out, you can see how big that texture is relative to my drawing. So what I might do is I'm going to hold down Shift on my keyboard and just make this a little bit smaller, just so it takes up, relative size to the sofa. All right, and then hit Enter on my keyboard to finish the command. Now that's done. And this is why you want to make sure your colors are on another layer, because when I zoom right in to this sofa, you can see there's like a small amount of blue on those lines next to it. This is why it's so important to turn off the colors layer underneath, so you don't see that, you don't get that seeping through. All right, so that's my sofa material. There's a ton of editing that we're going to do to these materials once they're all applied, but there's no point doing that yet. We'd just be wasting time. What I will do though is rename that. I'm going to call that one sofa. I'll call that one sofa texture. And then I'm going to create another layer, which is just going to be a standard layer. I'm going to grab my paint bucket tool. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sample my terrazzo, so I get this like pinky color. And I might just color in the pillows. So one on that side, and then I'll do the back two on this side. Okay. And then I'm going to I'm holding down Alt on my keyboard to pick up some of this bluey gray. And I might make this a bit more of like a blue, a baby blue, sky blue, something like that. And I'm going to paint the other. Oh, it's probably still too bright, so click on that. And yep. All right, so they're the couch, the pillows on the couch, and I'll click on this and I'll call these ones pillows. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take both of these layers, so hold down Shift to select both of them and then group them and then call this sofa. And then in order to drag the stack, because I want this at the top of the stack, I'll click on where it says sofa and just move my hand, and you can see it moves where the layer goes. And I might just put it above the paint buckets layer. I'll right click on it and let's turn that to a green layer. Okay, so if I turn that layer off, it turns off the paint bucket, so it turns off the pillows, and it also turns off the material. And when I turn that on and click on the group, you can see over pillows layer and then the texture for the sofa. This is important because, you know, even the sofa, the more detailed it gets, the sofa might end up with like 4 or 5 layers because you're going to have shadows and light and different scratchy textures perhaps. And so you want to make sure that you put as much into folders as possible. It will make your life, or into groups as possible, make your life a lot easier. So what you need to do in order to move on to the next component of this really is just start adding textures everywhere. Now, I don't mind how flat the textures look, but you'll see when you turn the CAD lines off, it will start to look pretty cool. Like it makes like white lines everywhere, and that actually looks quite cool. But really, we want to fill this out with every type of texture. And it is about choosing, similar to the flooring, you want to choose something that's relatively mild, and monochromatic or pastel-y is a good choice. And then basically apply a texture to everything. And you can do that because you have appropriately applied colors to everything. So you can see here, I've got a color for the beds here, or here we can see these 2 beds have got the same sort of green. So that will be my doona cover and my pillows. But then here, my normal sheets is like a dark green. Or take, for instance, the side tables. These here are like your bedside tables. Whatever material I choose to put there, because I'm selecting that yellow, is also going to be applied to the side table, the reading side table in the study, and will be the same side tables and bedside tables as in the master. So your job will be to apply a texture to absolutely everything in the project that hasn't used the paint bucket, which again, we went through before. After that, we then want to start applying some blocks. So what blocks are in this instance is just images, and in this instance will be plan images. So, and what we want to find is PNGs. So I've gone to Google, and I've just typed in Google image search, pot plant PNG plan. Now, the PNG component is important because what that means is that the image is cut out. So let's take like this this plan of the plant here. You can see you got this gray checkerboard. Again, that means there's no information around this plant. So I can just click and drag this wherever I want. If it's a JPEG image, so let's say for instance like this has a white background. So when I drag this image into my Photoshop file, I'll basically have a white square with an image in it. That's okay, we can still get rid of that, but it's much easier and will be a big time saver if you have a PNG file. So every time I search a block, I make sure I put in PNG into the search bar. It will make life a lot easier. Just note though, sometimes some of these websites are a bit cheeky in that, you know, you'll see this checkerboard, and then when you right click and go to save the file, you can see here it's still saving it as a JPEG. That means this checkerboard is fake, and if I drag this into my Photoshop file, I'm going to have a square with a checkerboard there. They're rubbish, those files, so just don't use those. You want to actually find a file that when you click on it, let's see if this one's a real, I don't think that's a real PNG. Okay, so I click on this one, that's one I had before. I right click, say save image. You'll see it's actually saved as a PNG image, and you can see I've previously saved it. It's got like a black background because there is no background, which that's perfect. All right, so I'll go back into Photoshop and let's open that up, which I think no, I haven't done that. There's some other ones. So file open. All right, I've got a JPEG and a PNG, so I want to show you both workflows. So with the PNG, it's easy. I can just click and drag, and you see it's already perfectly cut out. So in order to get this into the file, I can just click using the move tool, click, and then drag it over my tab, which is my project, which is this one, and it just appears over the top of everything. Now notice the layers are important because here it's sitting above my flooring, but underneath my marble bench texture. So, which is, you can see this denoted here. So first things first, I'm going to double click on this and call this one leafy plant. And then I'm going to drag this layer to the top of the stack. Click and drag. Now you can see it sits above everything else. And then in order to transform this and move this around, it's very similar to how we did that with the texture. So I go Control T on my keyboard. that brings up the control, the transform tools, and then I can just adjust them. Again, holding down shift makes sure that when I change this size, it stays relative. And then when I'm happy with the size, I hit enter. And now I can drag this around. So Control T. And if I want to rotate it, I can go Control T and then use the transform tool, hold my mouse over one of the corners, and then click and drag, and that rotates it. So something like that looks pretty good. Then enter. I'll move that around. Yep. Looks pretty cool. Now if I want another one, I could just go Control C, Control V, but that will create a second layer. So keep an eye up here where it says leafy plant. If I go Control C, Control V, it creates another whole layer. And yeah, I can move that around, but I've now got 2 layers, and that becomes very confusing if we have like 4 or 5 of these leaves, these plants. So the other way to do it is similar to how we copy textures. So I'm on my leafy plant layer. I'm going to go up to my marquee tool, click that, and then drag across. So I select that element, then hit V on my keyboard or the move tool, and then hold down Alt on my keyboard so I get the double arrows, which means I'm copying it. Click and drag, and now I'm taking a copied version around the floor plan. So let's say, for instance, I'll put one in the study. So I'll put one there, and oops. If I hold down Alt on my keyboard, I'll create another copy and then another copy. I can keep going with that. But with this one selected, I can then hit Control T and I can move it. So let's say I move it to be something like that. Hit enter, and then I'll move it back here. Now, in order to finish this, I need to deselect it. And remember that the command for deselect is Control D. Now that's deselected. But you'll see now that if I click and drag, I'm going to move both of those around because they're both on the same layer. Okay, so that's my leafy plant. And then what I'll do is, let's go again. Let's use the first version of the pot plant. So this is a JPEG image. What I'm going to do is firstly unlock this layer. So click the padlock. Then I'm going to use select, and then click on color range. And then I'm going to click on the white areas. So when I do that, you can see now anything that's black will not be selected. Anything that's white will be selected. And I might bring this fuzziness up so there's a little bit more, just so I get like all the sharp edges. So I'll click OK. Now you can see it's all selected. I hit delete on my keyboard and then Control D to deselect. Now I've gotten rid of the white background. I'm left with basically a PNG image. So now using my move tool, I can click and drag this into my project file that we were just in. And there's our second pot plant. So I'm going to shrink this right down. Use shift on my keyboard, zoom in. I'll put that on my kitchen bench. And now let's say I want another one on like the vanity in the bathroom. Again, I'll go M on my keyboard for marquee and select that pot plant. Click V or click the move tool. Hold Alt on my keyboard so I get the double arrows, and then click and drag. And then I'll put another one here. And then I might put another one in this bathroom. Just there for now. Okay, and then Control D, and now that's done. Now we're going to do a lot of work to these plants as well. We can do color corrections and other things to it, but let's do that a bit later. First things first, we want to apply textures to everything in the project, and then maybe bring in a few blocks, starting with plants. Let's start with just a few plants. And you can see now how the green just sort of balances up the image a little bit more. The last thing I will do though, I'm going to make sure I name that. I'm going to call this one small pot plants. And then again, I'm going to put these two inside a group. So select both of them, group. Actually, let's go the other way. So let's say I don't select either of these. I just click, I'll just click group, double click on that, and we'll call this one vegetation. I can then click on these layers and drag them into the group. So I can click and drag, and when I hold my mouse over the group name, you can see that sort of group highlights, and I can let go, and now it indents, showing that it's inside that group. I'll do the same thing for the leafy plant. I'll click that, drop and drag, and then you can see it's in the group. I'll right click and give that another color, shut that, and now you can see when I turn that off, those plants, those pot plants all turn on and off. Okay. So again, your task for this week is to complete texturizing everything in the project. So that's chairs, tables, bedspreads, and then using your paint bucket tool to paint everything that hasn't got a texture. So again, think of anything that's stainless steel or like a plastic acrylic, the wardrobes and any of those service cupboards that don't really have anything else that could go in there. There's no texture to be applied. Also your bench tops you need a texture for. And then once you're done with that, you can do a little bit of editing as I've shown in this video, but you don't have to do too much for now. Just get the bulk of your content in there, and then start with some blocks. So again, start with some vegetation, but you may want to find some books, or you may want to find a computer for the study and have the computer in there. And basically the rule of thumb is just whatever you're searching for. Let's say it's a computer, so you just say like computer, plan, view, PNG, or book, plan, view, PNG, and you'll find images in Google searching, Google image search that will suit your needs.